There's a tremendous amount in your work that I am interested to speak to you about across the meaning of story, value, metacrisis, techno-feudalism, intimacy, death.
That's a bunch.
It's a bunch, and too much for today, I'm sure.
We got it. Let's go. 20 hours. Let's go. You ready?
Yeah, we'll see how we do. Yeah, perhaps we could begin. I'm curious how you relate with the meaning of story. What does story mean? What is it to transmit it?
Story. God. Story is such a story. I was talking to my dear friend Howard Bloom recently, about a year ago. It was 2 years ago. And one of the things in stories, it's hard to follow the timeline, which seems to keep shifting. But I was sharing with him some thoughts about story, and as I began, he cut me off and he said, "Well, what are you talking about? Story is a human creation." And I said, "Howard, whoa, let's hold for a second." And we went into a very beautiful, we've been talking for about 7 years, and he's a close interlocutor, a very beautiful conversation about story where I tried to show, and Howard, who's identifies himself as a stone cold atheist, but Howard's an atheist like I'm the Pope, right? He's more of a materialist mystic, is a better way to kind of talk about him. But in the end, he concurred, right? He shifted his position in a kind of very substantive way, and that's of course, the nature of his depth, and his, I've learned a lot from Howard about multiple dimensions of science. So what I said to Howard was, it was this conversation, that story is actually a structure of cosmos, but not as a poetic assertion, although science read and felt deeply is ultimately poetic. And if I could flip the camera on and you'd see my desk, it's piled with a mixture of Aramaic texts and Hindu texts and Sufi texts and science texts. And so I don't actually experience them as being different in any way. They're speaking to the same cosmos in a very fundamental way. And one of my projects over the last 9 years, which I'm about to try and publish, is kind of how you read science. And because I'm a little bit of an idiot in science, right? So I read it very simply, right? Meaning, I kind of didn't really go to high school, although I got a diploma. Didn't really go to college, although I got a diploma. Didn't really go to a master's, although I got a diploma, and didn't really go to any classes, and I got a doctorate. And my mother was happy that it was from Oxford, my Jewish son. But basically, I didn't do science in high school, so I came to science very late. And because of that, I read very slowly, right? And when you read slowly, you're like, chemistry. What does that word mean? Isn't it funny that my friend just called me and said she's going out with a new person and she said they have great chemistry? That's interesting. And now we have this hydrogen and helium and lithium and we've got these chemical elements and they're calling them both chemistry. How interesting is that? And so what I've done is, and I've done this with many students over the last decade, where we'll actually read in our private study structure, we'll read scientific texts and I'll push them and I'll tell them, push me, right? So that we don't take any word for granted, right? In other words, so just for example, I was just reading a scientific essay about mitochondria, and how mitochondria kind of accesses, if you will, the electron currency and the electron transport system, right? In order to, literally animate our skin cells or bone cells. As you and I are talking right now, mitochondria is in wild and dazzling, display, not of a mystical kind, in a kind of, abstract sense, but in a kind of mystical empirical kind. It's happening right now as you and I are having this conversation. So story, right, is very related to that. In other words, actually, there's about 4 elements to a story. And those elements, Tim, and I'd be delighted to go back and forth with you on each one, right? As we just kind of have this conversation as, as friends here, chatting, right? those elements are actually present all the way down the evolutionary chain. And those elements, just maybe we'll put them on the table in a second, then I'll pass back to you if that's okay, right? So
Sure.
those elements would be something like there's an inherent relationship between events.
Mhm.
So, if we can borrow David Hume, right, there's a necessary connection, not just a constant conjunction, right? So there's this inherent kind of interdigitation between events. There's a sense of one thing leading to the next. There's a story, right? One. Two, the story is animated by a particular quality, which is desire. Two. Three, it's a desire for value, right? And as it's not just a desire, it's a desire always for value, for more value, right? And it's three, and four, right? That desire for value actually is the plot line. There's actually a plot line, right? So there's a plot line, which is the desire for value and for ever more value, right? And, perhaps, depending how you count, but we could say five, right, is that there's both an inherent movement towards the fulfillment of the plot line, meaning ever more desire for ever more value. And there's also these interruptions, right, crises, where there's an actual blockage to value. There's an obstruction to value, right? There's something that is actually undermining value. And that crisis, as in the famous Chinese symbol in which crisis and opportunity are the same, that crisis is an evolutionary driver, right? The Hebrew word for crisis is shever, a shattering. And in Loranic Kabbalah, the shattering of the vessels is what creates the next stage. So the crisis actually drives, so crisis creates the next stage. So the next stage of value, the next stage in the plot line of the story is created in response to the crisis. And last in this particular counting, we're getting to six, but the counting changes each time. But last is there's some dimension of freedom, right? In other words, if there wasn't freedom, it would be a mechanical manual, be a tech manual. You'd be reading a tech manual, right? So I'm just to give you an example. So you and I just got to chat for a few minutes before we started. So imagine, and it was a nuanced conversation. I think, is that fair to say? It was a nuanced conversation. It was an interesting conversation. So imagine had we both been reading from a script, right? It's Tim's there reading from a script, Mark's reading from a script, and I read my lines, he reads his lines. That's weird, right? It's the communicative assumption implicit in the inherent space in between the cherubs, which with us being the cherubs above the Ark of the Covenant, as it were, in that kind of architectonic, is that there's freedom, is that Tim's reaching inside of himself and he's finding his response. Now, how much freedom Tim has or Mark has is actually open to question. So it's good for us to challenge the level of freedom we actually have. How much else is at play, which actually undermines the fullness of that freedom, is a good question. But so I'm not talking about an absolute freedom. That's a naive view of freedom, but that there's an element, a dimension of freedom. So those are six dimensions, and I intentionally counterposed those. Right? The person I'm taking issue here with, because I think he's wrong, is Aristotle, right? Who has a version and understanding of story and elements of story. These are very different than his elements, right? As Howard pointed out to me, right? But I think they're actually, they work. They're right? In other words, and these elements of story, it's gorgeous, actually apply all the way down, all the way up the evolutionary chain. So for example, someone who heard me talk about this sarcastically wrote a blog post. I've never spoken to the person. The person was a colleague of Zach's. And it was something about kind of, hey, I'm really tired about these guys. They didn't mention us by name, but talking about this new story all the time. But it was a very clear response to that. And then this person wrote, and they cited Muriel, I can never pronounce her last name, Rukeismer, Rukeysmer, et cetera, the poet, who says, reality is not made up of atoms, reality is made up of stories. And then this writer responds, somewhat sarcastically and flippantly, and says, yeah, but reality is made up of atoms also, right? Kind of dismissing that notion. But of course, he missed the essential point, which is atoms are stories too, That's the point. An atom is not a thing. An atom is a story, right? There's a logos, right, to an atom, which is why in the original Hebrew, the word davar, thing, is also dibur, word. So that's a bit of a sense of story, meaning there's an ontology to story, right? Reality is actually constituted by stories, right? All the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain, which is why stories cohere us. So that's at least a beginning. And I'm sensitive to our context. I would plead guilty to a podcast sometimes going on for like 20 minutes. So I'm stopping myself, right? Because there's about 30 other things that are important for story. But that's enough on the table to kind of begin the conversation. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So you mentioned that your sense of story, its fundamentality, could we say is not you're not putting it forward as just poetic, where just poetic would presumably be something like an activity that, in this case, human beings engage with. It's a sort of contingency, and it might help us grasp or relate to disparate things because we might lack the categories to otherwise.
Right.
And so we're sort of playing across the top somewhere. And maybe we say sort of things about how stuff happens for us, but it's that sort of separate, and
That's
it's
that's
not.
exactly the position I'm rejecting. Right.
Yes,
That's exactly correct.
right. And so, in a sense, what I'm hearing then is poetry as a mode of, let's use the word description, but it's not enough just yet, a mode of description of certain qualities, certain processes of interaction. So we wanted to
Well,
get a different angle on how things connect and how they relate. We are using so I'm adopting this position. I'm walking into it rather than coming right from the root of it. And so as I'm walking into it, I'm still present with the connotations of notions like desire and of value, in that sense of wanting something, wanting to move into the becoming of something, wanting to, because
yeah.
of course we think about forces like push and pull from a different way of modeling and relating to how things interact is kind of dead. Why need
Yes.
a story for just the dynamics of push and pull? And so what I'm curious about is, well, so many things. I'm curious about the
Curious.
mm,
Well, Tim, while you're thinking, let's go back a step, okay, brother? Just for a second, if you can, if you're up for it.
sure.
Which is, when you talked about poetics. So, in general, we make in the West any number of false distinctions. We're very good at certain things in the West, in our kind of Western thinking. And one of our monumental, colossal mistakes is overdrawn dichotomies, unresolved dialectics,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to kind of getting a sense of the kind of the central whole, right, of reality that co-arises and that is actually not contradictory but paradoxical, right? So, for example, there is no ultimate split between noetics and poetics, right? You can't actually split them. The noetic and the poetic, right? Gnosis and poetry are deeply and profoundly related, right? They're both dimensions of the sensual, right? And Adam knew his wife Eve, right? Genesis 4:1, right? Knowledge itself is a sensual act, right? And poetry is a sensual movement in which we're trying to stretch the boundary of word, right, into the deeper underlying Tao or silence. But you can't make that split. Or I'll give you another example. Let's say hedon and daemon, right, is another, right, pleasure and meaning. We make this strange split, or eros and agape, right? These are all very, very, very bad splits, right? And
I hear you.
yeah, like go.
So I hear you, and so I agree. But I want to say we can make the split because we have now. The split would then be, let's call it an epistemic mode with limitations and issues. You've
That
articulated
works.
some.
But we as long as we hold it, right, as as a way of approaching reality, then we step back from it and we move towards the larger whole.
Right, indeed. And the reason why I'm pausing here is because that's the context that we are relating with, so as to move into, from a place that isn't already just there, to move into relating with. So I wrote a dissertation 8 years ago. It was called Part Making, Whole Making, and Process. So I certainly care about this stuff, right? Like, now, what I'm curious about is, I'm curious about how story as a phenomenon, as a mover and shaper of worlds, of civilization, of people. I'm curious about, I mean, my question initially was, what is it to transmit story? And, what is it to receive story? What is it to participate in story? There are different modes of relating to story in the very transmission of it. One could be seen as from a more, well, let's think about text in that sense. And you mentioned scripted. Anyone could read the same story. Would it be the same transmission? I mean, almost certainly not, right? Something, and yet, so what is it otherwise? What is this other thing? What is it to share in now, let's say, a more second person context, through the mess of interaction, in a sense where the same story told the same way may not do the same, may not share the same value, might not be of service to the value that was seeking to be transmitted in quite the same way. It might need to be told in a different way, still oriented from the same basis of, let's say, care or values. What I'm curious about in the context of our world today, what is it to share story? What is it to open and support the participation in the recognition of there being a greater than, of there being a whole that we belong to, one that, from my perspective, is, well, I'm curious about your thoughts on this as a sort of aside here. It's deeply related. I do tend to stress in my own, I would say, writing and context, about 90% of the time, whole making, rather than whole as such, unless one is building into the notion of whole already the verb. And so I'm stressing the verb, right? Because the whole, in some sense, I can't grasp it and stand separate from it to know totally that it's fully, finally complete. I've now separated myself from it. I've made a kind of part of it as a kind of, almost kind of an analysis of it. And so I'm curious about what is on the pulse of relating to such things as meta-crisis, binding in our time, ethics, response, collective action, all these types of things, education. So much rests on the integrity with which we hold the meaning of story and what it is to share story. So I'm asking, what is it to share story?
So that is, my friend Tim, what you're asking at the end or in your last sentence, but you covered quite a lot of turf along the way. So let's see if we can kind of pick up some of the turf along the way and then kind of get to your last question or last inquiry. And I'm pausing to see if we can find kind of the right way in that will allow us to kind of cut through a much larger and broader conversation to try and find the core of it. So I just happen to right now be giving a series of talks on Sundays at this forum we call One Mountain, Many Paths, So I think we're in our 420th week or something like that. And in the next 5-6 weeks, a colleague, Yuval Harari, put out a new book called Nexus. And so I'm doing like 7 or 8 weeks and kind of using Yuval as a little bit of a foil and doing about 7 or 8 talks about, what one scholar, Chaim Soloveitchik, calls the kind of uncontaminated position, right? And he means that in a scholarly sense, where sometimes a person who's not a philosopher, not even really per se a thinker in a kind of a certain kind of way, but they're actually honest. They don't pull the punch, right? They're an honest reflection of the zeitgeist. And I think Yuval is that paradoxically, right? He's actually neither a philosopher nor a good philosopher, nor a bad philosopher. He's just not doing philosophy. He's not doing spirituality. He's a popular or populist historian, right? He gave the kind of overview course when he first went to Hebrew U. His specialty is actually have his doctorate right here, is wars between 1150 and 1550. That's his particular academic specialty. And he's kind of picked up on this notion of story, right? In, I think, one of the most, but not, again, not him. This is not about demonizing or attacking Yuval. Yuval, bless you, brother, right? It's about he's an uncontaminated kind of reflection or parroting of the zeitgeist, which is all about story. And essentially, what Yuval notes, based on a bunch of anthropologists, is that, story coheres reality. Now, that's correct. And what Yuval argues in about 15 or 20 different passages, as well as in a children's book, right, which is actually about this topic. I actually happened to be that last night at about 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. I read the children's book, right? And it basically, and what you say to a child when you're looking at a child in the eye, right, tells you a lot about what you actually believe. But he's actually consistent. And this is where I actually admire Yuval, and he doesn't pull the punch, right? But then you realize how tragic it is, how problematic it is, to major an understatement, and just to say it's not about this one person. Again, he's an uncontaminated expression of the zeitgeist, where Barack Obama says, yeah, he's the dude. And Bill Gates says, yeah, he's got that, right? And Jeff Bezos says, right? And there's a long list of legacy thinkers, Klaus Schwab, et cetera, who are basically endorsing his view of this as expressing kind of the default scientific view, right? And his claim is stories are completely made up, right? Stories are fiction. They don't reflect truth per se, although occasionally they can, right? It's not that they can't, but that's not essentially what they do. Essentially, they are structures of coherence and in a mechanical cosmos, meaning why that's so, who the fuck knows, right? But that is the way it is, right? And essentially, right, the major stories that are told in civilization, whether that's about God, right, and Yuval likes to move from kind of God religion to currencies and corporations. He likes to kind of play in that domain. Currencies and corporations are made up stories. God's a made up story, right? Value is a made up story, right? So Yuval, for example, will say time and again, human rights are completely made up. There's actually no validity to them, right? They have no ontology, or, in my language, they're not backed by the universe.
That's his story within the story.
So that is the story that Yuval's telling, right? But what he's saying actually, which is of course always the performative contradiction of that postmodern moment, right? He's saying, but this is actually true, right? And other than, of course, Nagel, Charles Taylor, right? Many people have pointed to this, performative contradiction, and that's correct. But it's really critical to understand. It's a very big deal. Now, if that's the case, now I'm going to suggest an alternative view, obviously. But the answer to your question, what is the act of telling a story? Well, it really depends on what a story is, right? If a story is a fiction, so essentially the act of telling a story is the act of a propagandist. If story is real, right, story is reflecting a truth of reality in some fundamental way, even if the story is distorted. And this is a key thing I want to try and get to be able to say here, just because it deserves to be said. I haven't said it out loud yet. I actually just said it in a Vox to Zach, earlier today, which is, but let me just add 2 sentences. So if story is real, as I've tried to describe it, and story is describing something which is actually true in reality, right? So story is a vehicle, a vessel for holding light, right? It participates, right, in the goodness, truth, and beauty of reality. So then the storyteller is an educator. Then the storyteller's a lover. Then the storyteller's a priest. Then the storyteller is a shaman, right? Then the storyteller is a philosopher king, right? Not a propagandist, right? Because the difference between the two is enormous. And if you compare, for example, Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity, 71, or Walden 2, 47, or his earlier papers, where he talks about behavioral engineering, he sounds like he's talking about education until you realize he's not, because he thinks there's no field of value. He's actually saying it's all propaganda. It's all behavioral engineering. So is story the act of a behavioral engineer, or is story the act of an educator? That's everything. Now, one last thing, and then back to you, my friend, which is critical. So Yuval makes an argument which, kind of wows audiences worldwide. He makes it with an enormous amount of flair and good timing. It's well done. He's a good deliverer. And he says, well, obviously stories are fictional. And then he cites a whole bunch of stories. The Catholic Church, do you really believe, and he goes through a bunch of things, or the Bible, right? It got wrong, the archaeological issue of this and of that, and where the original Homo families came from, and, in the age of the earth, et cetera. It's just as clearly said these stories are clearly not true. And yet everybody believes them. So clearly there's not a relationship between the story being true and believing them. So that is so fundamentally wrong. Right? And people just kind of stop when he says it, because it's like, it's a good point. Now, of course, it is a compelling point, but it's wrong. And that's what's so critical. In other words, when a person believes the story of the Catholic Church, the reason, let me step back. Yuval ignores the reason that stories cohere. For him, that's a mechanical quirk of cosmos. But that's obviously absurd, right? And we need to ask, why do stories create coherence? In other words, why is it that it's a transcultural, transtemporal feature of reality that stories cohere? Why is that true? It's not a mechanical blip. It's true because when we want to get 20 people to cooperate, we have to all know each other, Dunbar number, right? We need to know each other, trust each other. But we can also trust each other through participating in the same story. So 20,000 of us can know each other intimately through having access to the same story, and we meet in the story. But why? Because in the story, we recognize some deep resonance of truth, goodness, and beauty. Right? So even if the story is wrong, so let's say the Catholic Church got virginity postpartum, maybe not, right? And they got a whole bunch of things wrong. But that's not what people are responding to. People are not responding to the details of virginity postpartum, or are you redeemed, when the coin falls into the alms box, or, there's all these dialectics, or when you drop it, or when it touches the bottom. That's not what they're responding to. Is, infinity loves you so much. Infinity is willing to suffer for you, right? Kindness, right? The Sermon on the Mount, right? The sense of my own inadequacy and the need for a force that's larger than me to somehow liberate me. And there's an entire series of truths, right, that actually live in a story, even when the story is contorted and distorted and corrupted and ethnocentric, right, and deserves to be rejected. Now, this is it's a hugely critical understanding. So the reason people respond and cohere around story is because they're having a shared anthro-ontological experience. And they recognize each other in that shared anthro-ontology. And it's the first time I'm saying this out loud. I've been thinking about it for the last day. So it's beautiful that you started with story. And of course, it's an intimate universe and no coincidences, but it's very beautiful. It's very, very beautiful. It's very exciting because you realize, this is not a mechanical blip in cosmos, right? We trust each other because we're intimate, because we actually recognize that we're resonant with this story together because we have a shared anthro-ontology. That actually changes our relationship to story. That means stories are not fictional, they're partial. That's an entirely different world that we live in now. Okay, that was a lot. Thank you for your patience and where is it? Hold on one second. Here it is. Hold on. There we go. I'm passing the microphone back to you. There we go. Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe that was a big pen. I apologize.
No, not at all. That's all good. I'm with you. I understand. I could spend some time sharing back what I heard, but I would do it with words that probably aren't as easy to follow, which itself as an expression can be folded in quite nicely to where I think it's interesting to move this conversation next. One of the things that comes to mind is the question, why? What then? Why? Why does that happen? But what about that? That the child asks again and again. And eventually the explanation of the adult is exhausted. And then what do we do at that moment? And that becomes, well, that in a sense, potentially do what we do with that moment is of the essence of education. Now, in the context of partial stories, that some in a group, whether of 150 or 20,000 or a whole civilization, begin to see, that seems pretty partial over here. And some others are like, we're a bit uncomfortable with you mentioning that. We actually are secure in the sense that it's whole, and we're going to repress that. We're going to, whether consciously or less consciously. And so the participation in the transformation of the stories that we tell is critical. Now, in a sense, here we find discourse. Here we find dynamics where competition is welcome, let's say, as well, as long as that's well held in the context of a deeper story that is binding that competition. And yet there comes a place, and it's easier to think of the child, but certainly I can speak for myself, where we come into contexts where it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to actually relate with the error or the uncertainty where there may be error, or certainly where there may be unknowns. And whether it's an institution, whether it's a family, in whatever context the relationship might want to prevent the further inquiry and the further participation in the understanding of story, but therefore also the creation of story, there can be a kind of deadness. I like Charles Sanders Peirce's a short line, I always say it: do not block or do not bar the way of inquiry. Something like this. Decent rule of thumb, but then sometimes the time is not right for a particular inquiry. Sometimes particular stories need to be told. And so this kind of brings up some very interesting, there's a very human, deeper than human tension here. And it seems we encounter this all the time. In a sense, there's an enabling element of that constraint, but it can also become tyrannical, in a sense, just like any religion, any institution, in terms of the power structure of it, can be deeply enabling for the path, becoming, but then also prevent it in some critical ways from realizing its unique participation in what you would refer to as a unique self-symphony, and to use some of this type of language. And I think it's beautiful language that helps in some of these links.
Mhm.
And so on the cusp then, this relationship between propaganda and education, the criticality of the social processes, and we can talk about the exoteric and the esoteric here, right? And intimacy becomes critical because it becomes a matter of, well, what capacities, qualities, both in the individual sense, but also in the relational sense, might be necessary to engage with deep criticality, deep challenge,
Mhm.
but remain in that sense anchored and committed and bound in language you might use like devotion, in worship to something greater than, hey, life. In my language, I like to say loving transformation. And of course, in your work, you yourself and Zach use the term cosmo-erotic humanism. But before we can get to the place where we might understand what we mean by eros, what we mean by transformation, well, we've got to go through layers of story, layers of trust, layers of building context together, because of course this is tremendously multi-layered and polysemous. And so somewhere in there, what I'm pointing to is effective from my perspective. What is so tremendously lacking in our time in the network age, and maybe in other ages, you would certainly know as a scholar you are. I'm curious about examples from history, but I'm curious about how to support contexts for relating with the deep challenge, the deep criticality of challenge in the context of intimacy that may be necessary to relate truthfully, really, with the unfolding understanding and the recovering and discovering of understanding we might associate with the kind of meaning and light and value and goodness and darkness that is found in the depths of various religious traditions, in the unspoken hearts of the stories which bind so many peoples together, as we move into a time where it's not clear from the top line level, from a basic sense, how coherence, how participating in a shared story might be possible. I'm pointing to the absence of in a sense, a kind of a praxis, a mode of relating structurally supported in the context of sharing story, which I don't find enough of in any one particular book. The book is valuable, right? But it would seem like there's such a profundity in what it is to share story in the manner that we're opening up here, especially given the partiality, precisely because of the partiality. So that's where I pass it back over to you.
Yeah. Let's pick it up, from right there. And, as I think I'm probably not the first to point out to you, right? You're using language in a rich and sometimes ambiguated way. So
Mm-hmm.
one could go in many different directions there. But I want to try and kind of a little bit disambiguate, if you will, right? And try and find kind of the second simplicity thread here, right? As opposed to the first simplicity thread. And I think that the word that comes to mind is trust.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
It's trust, right? It's really about trust. Our capacity to have these conversations, our capacity to transmit story in a way in which it can be received, right? And it's often, people ask me or ask Zach or ask both of us, as we're kind of engaged in this, really our real engagement is in the enactment of a world religion as a context for our diversity. And, we kind of have a policy. We never say one word without the other. A world religion as a context for our diversity. And one, and two, cosmoerotic humanism is one example of a story of value that would be at the center of a world religion as a context for our diversity. And in some sense, we haven't clarified that sufficiently in the public space, but just that distinction right there is something that we just spend a couple hours talking about at the local Chinese restaurant here in Vermont. And it's a very important context. So in order for there to be a world religion as a context for our diversity, which we need in response to the meta crisis, and I don't think we can walk through the meta crisis without it. That's a very serious thing to say, and I don't say it lightly. I say it, trembling. We need to be able to share a story that will be trusted, right? And the trust is not, I trust Zach or I trust Mark, right? Although that sometimes can play, but it's deeper. The story itself has to be trustable, right? The story has to stand. I mean, it's one of the reasons we took our own names out of the story. And we're writing under, at least one set of books under David J. Temple. So what evokes trust? Right? I mean, that's really, so let's flip the conversation for a second. So there's a beautiful word in Hebrew, amen, which is translated into English, it's amen, but the original word in Hebrew, aman, amen, means trust. It's mistranslated as faith, but actually means trust. The word faith actually doesn't exist in the actual Hebrew. It's always something closer to trust. And the word amen means trust. It means art. Oman is an artist. Second meaning. The third meaning is very, very beautiful, is imunim. It's kind of practice. So I'm kind of practicing. And the fourth meaning is omen, which is the nursing mother who holds a child at her breast. Omen. So there's this sense of the experience of trust is the experience that a baby has that her mother won't drop her. Right? It's that she knows, right? And we lose that experience. Let's not go down the Bowlby, Ainsworth, Kohut, Winnicott, kind of attachment theory route, but we lose that experience. And one of the things that contemporary thought has correctly focused on is what is that experience of loss that hadn't been paid attention to in history in some fundamental way. But we can regain the experience of trust through practice, right? And practice is too weak of a word. Actually, Layman asked me yesterday, when we were doing a series of conversations on the books that I've written leading up to cosmologic humanism, and we were on a book called Tears. So he asked me about, kind of practice and ritual, and I kind of shared with them, we were excited about it, that we need to kind of let go of, these kind of contemporary spiritual words like, practice, exercises. It's one of the reasons Zach and I switched from the word spirituality to religion. When I originally started this center with Ken Wilber, we called it Center for World Spirituality. And we, with intention, quite a bit of time later, called it the Center for World Philosophy and Religion. So we've gone from spirituality to religion, and we need to go from kind of practice and exercise to ritual. Because ritual is a place in which we discover, we evoke, we uncover the shared field of value that we both live in that is beneath any differences between us. So in other words, whatever values we hold, right? Tim's values, Mark's values, Jack's values, Simone's values, right? Underneath the diversity and polarization of values, there's a field of value, right? And in the field of value, we're together, right? And if I could kind of make it structurally available, right? The clash between values is a separate self clash, separate selves. So in terms of the line of development, which we might call self, separate selves clash over values. And then true self, as I'm in the field of value. And then unique self is I and you and I, we're not Tim and Mark, we're just value. We're true self, we're just value. And then we distinguish as individuated values beyond true self, where you might take choice and I might take life, for example. Let's take, but if we're both in the field of value, it's not a separate self clash, which is going to create polarization. We're both value before we distinguish as values, then we can trust each other. We can trust the stories we're telling. We're in a field of value. And then if Tim, for example, right, distinguishes himself as unique self, and Marc distinguishes himself as unique self, but let's pretend we're values. So we're in the field of values. So then Tim distinguishes, let's say, as choice, and Marc distinguishes as life. Now we can talk to each other without polarizing. We might disagree, right? We might have a great kind of cudgeling match, but we'll synergize. We'll be able to create new synergies because we're both in the field of value. So we can only trust each other to create those synergies and to hear each other's stories if we have a direct knowing that we're in the field of value. And so that's everything. Without that, there's no possibility of trust. Right? And if there's no possibility of trust, we can't ultimately coordinate because we don't have shared ordinating values. And so therefore we have no coherence, and therefore we have no resonance. And now to the word which you invoked, which, as you know, is one of my favorite words, we have no intimacy, right? Because intimacy is based on being intimacy is not based on identical values. That's what people assume. People assume, oh, we need the same values. No, we don't. We need to know that we're both in the field of value. And from there, we can create intimacy. And one of the demarcating characteristics of the intimate is trust. So I think if we can kind of cut through, right, a culture of eros is a culture of eros value. And maybe the last piece, Tim, in this regard, in any event, is, many years ago, new friend, or, knew we've known each other for a while, but we haven't talked in a long time. So it's good to talk to you. One of the things I used to talk about a lot was that, eros is a great value of cosmos. And then I would talk about, right, value itself has eros. And then I realized that those were both they were both very limiting ways to talk about it. And that to actually any split between those two words is actually false. It's a wrong split, or as you would say, it has limited epistemic value. We can use it and hold it, for a moment, and then we have to let it drop. And so I tried to begin over the last year, and it's become central to the way we're thinking, right, in cosmologic humanism, is talk about a new word we call eros value. It's one word. There's no split between them, right? So we need to generate a culture of eros value, which is a culture of trust. Not blind trust, not blind, not one which bypasses appropriate challenges, which is how you began, right, your conversation, or about a third in. But how are we intimate, and how do we hold challenges in the context of intimacy, right? It was one of the threads, right, in that very rich tapestry that you unfolded, right? So we hold challenges when we're in a field of eros value together, which is a field of trust. Right. And so the culture of eros value, and we need to generate a culture of eros value, becomes a culture of trust because we're in the field of value together. But if we're not, right, and tragically, the public culture of the immersive environment of the digital is precisely not a field of trust. And it's the elemental dimensions of pre-woke liberal democracy, which took the world, billions of years to get to. Fact-checking, evidentiary procedure, right? Innocent until proven guilty, right? Face-to-face conversation, right? Etc. are all literally blithely, right? Completely and utterly dismissed. They don't even begin, right? People get on comment threads and give themselves permission to speak in ways that are kind of abominable by any standard of decency. It happens in common threads all over the web, but there's no accountability because there's no intimacy, not just because people are anonymous. That's the assumption. The assumption, oh, it's anonymity or there's no repercussion. It's deeper than that. There's no shared field of value, right? There's not a value to speech. And so all of that begins to be the beginning of a conversation.
Yes, I do think that pulling out as you did and building out as you did, trust is absolutely central to what I was driving at. And then the context where, well, how much do human beings today, how much do I, how much do we, how much do people trust the world, trust each other, trust what's binding us? I think part of the inquiry there as well was one of the things I experienced as a real practical everyday story are the time and energy realities of people to invest in the possibility of trust, to invest in sharing time, opening up to, as you're articulating here, the field of value, which I notice as I say it, isn't the kind of thing I can be saying too easily, just because, I have a desire to share poetically in response to how I'm relating to the meaning of that. And I'm not in complete clarity about whether or not what I would say would be accepted. And yet, nevertheless, there's, I definitely got 80% of it. Do you know what I mean? If I got less than 80%, then
80's good.
I am confused.
80's good.
Yeah. Certainly, to trust when we live in a context that might be absent trust is to risk. Maybe the risk from the baby to the mother is implicit. The degree to which we can speak about choice there in relation to risk is interesting. Perhaps we might want to say there is, in a sense, a kind of a primordial choice that is being expressed. I don't know. That there's something interesting there. Certainly, we can't make as many choices when we are younger, and we enculturate and hopefully are educated so that we can make more choices. But in the context where we are struggling with trust, there is a risk, is there not, in investing the time and energy in any particular context to reopen, to participate in the field of value, and in a sense to risk energy for the strengthening of a mutual continuity of care. For what? Would be, I guess, at a slightly more basic level. Imbued by what, as what, all these types of things, eh? So what is it then to address a culture where there is a difficulty in risking to build trust?
Yeah. There's a category in this field of thought I've tried to unpack, which we're kind of calling unique self theory, which is actually sorely in need of update. Right? I published a book on unique self in like 2011, then another one in like 2012 called Self, and then another one in 2014 where we changed a couple of things, but it was basically a restatement and reformulated a little bit in Return to Eros in 2016. But we really haven't updated unique self theory, which is something which causes me to lose quite a bit of sleep at night, is I feel out of integrity. So we're going to be this year, Claire Molinaire, thank you, Claire, is who runs our Unique Self Institute. We're going to do a kind of like an ongoing 4 or 5 months of several weeks each month. I guess there are several weeks in a month where we're going to try and clarify unique self theory. What have we learned in the last 13 years? And one of the issues is going to be I want to really try and deepen and write a couple of chapters on unique self symphony, which you alluded to, and the others on unique risk. Right, which was what this long sentence was leading to, and unique risk is unimaginably important. Right, in other words, it's probably what I've thought about more, in certain ways than anything else in the last X amount of years. But risk is a structure of cosmos, just like story. right? Risk is not a human invention, right? Risk goes all the way down the evolutionary chain, right? You have, there are evaluations that quarks make in the first nanoseconds after the Big Bang, when the gazillions of quarks rain, and there are 6 kinds of quarks. Then there's 2 up quarks and a down quark. Proton, 2 down quarks and up quark, neutron, and do they get together? Do they not get together? Right, is a risk. Right, there's and most of those risks don't work out well. Right, stable relationships in the first 15 minutes after the Big Bang are not easy to accomplish, although some of them last. And really all the way up the evolutionary chain, there is a risk of investment of energy, extravagant, flamboyant energy, right, required, right, particularly in the realm of eros and in the realm of sexing. I mentioned Howard Bloom before. Howard is coming out with a new book, which we've started something called World Philosophy and Religion Press. We're really not publishing other books that are not part of cosmologic humanism, except for one of Howard's, where he talks about kind of the flamboyant nature of cosmos, right, in the kind of unfolding of sexuality. And Howard has his read of it, which I would strongly disagree with, but he does a brilliant job of the science, right, which is like, there's this huge amount of risks you're taking, right, to engage in eros, right? You have to expend, in a world in which you're supposed to only expend limited amounts of energy to get limited, particular results. You've got to expend all this time and make yourself radically vulnerable, whether you're a brower bird or a person, right? Warren Farrell has written, my dear friend, extensively about the 40 risks that a man takes when he asks a woman on a date. He goes through all 40, right? So there's this intense sense of risk. Which risks do I take? It's a very, 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 very beautiful question. And I remember, if I can be, with permission, a little intimate and personal in a way that I'm not usually in this kind of conversation, but I remember a particular moment in 2005, which I won't detail, but in which I called someone who wanted to kind of spend some time. And I said, and it was a full integrity situation on every level. And I said to this person, I said, hey, I just want to say that, there's a certain risk here. I'm kind of trusting your integrity, right? And the person said to me, one of those kind of swearings up and down that, their integrity was trustable. That turned out to be very much not the case. Right? Yeah, right. And I look back and I say, what was I thinking? And then I go back and I say, I'd probably do the same thing again. Right? In other words, I don't want to be a person who refuses to trust. Right? I don't want to allow reality to beat that out of me. Right? I refuse. If there's one thing I've refused to do, Tim, is to become cynical. I've refused to become bitter. Just utterly fucking refused. Like, I will not become bitter. I will not become cynical. And even that refusal itself wasn't some great egoic act of mine. It was a gift of grace, right? In other words, anything we claim is not ours, right? Anything is traceable back to something moving through us that's larger than us, that we can only just fall on our face in devotion and say thank you to, right? But I've repeated that situation again, right? And I've risked again, right? And it's turned out better, right? But there are those, who would say, are you out of your fucking mind? Right? Why would you take a risk again? And the answer is because my heart will die if I'm not able to trust. Now, the response to that, though, is, okay, now let's distinguish. Not all risks should be taken. Some risks are foolhardy. That's taken me quite a while to learn. Right? That was not an obvious truth. Right? My general default nature, right, is to trust. That's kind of just, I'm built that way. I trust. Right. And I love to trust. Right. And I love to trust immediately. Right. In other words, you talked about very elegantly before kind of these stages and layering. Layering, I believe, was the word you beautifully deployed. So, and that's deeply true, which is a gradual process of enlightenment. But then there's that kind of story in Zen Buddhism where the jug of water breaks and, right, Satori. Right. So there's also a moment where, right, we just recognize each other in a moment. Right? We're on a bus and we see each other and we smile and the entire world explodes. And so I tend towards, right, just in my being, that kind of trust, and the world has demanded of me to discern, well, what's actually a legitimate risk, what's not, where am I being noble to trust, and where am I being grossly irresponsible and out of integrity, and what's the difference between integrity and evolutionary integrity, and how things affect generations. None of the things that I consider wisely, right, in earlier years. So this notion of unique risk is, what is the risk, Tim? And yours and mine are obviously different because you are reality having a Tim experience, and I'm reality having a Marc experience. And if reality was trying to have a Tim experience and med Marc, it would be quite disappointed and be like, ew, right? Yuck, right? An unfiltered Latin word, right? And so we have different unique risks. And my unique risk is a function of my unique self, right? And my unique risk is the risk that if I don't take it, I die. Something dies in my unique self, right? In other words, to not take my unique risk is to commit suicide. To not cultivate discernment around what my unique risk is radically foolhardy, but worse than foolhardy, right? Ultimately causes damage, right? It causes damage in the ecosystems, right? Even when we're innocent, right? Even when we're innocent, we can still cause damage in the ecosystem because we took a risk that shouldn't have been taken and we were unaware of it, right? And so there's a place where maybe I'll finish this and pass it back to you, my friend. There's a place where we need to move from our first innocence to our second innocence, right? And as we or from, I sometimes call it first simplicity and second simplicity, but I like the word innocence better, right? And I'm using it more these days because we can't lose our innocence, right? We can't lose our innocence. And our first innocence is inappropriate. It's pre-tragic. So we need to go through the tragic and get to the post-tragic, right? Which is one of the ways I like to describe it to myself, is I created that set of categories to explain reality to myself, so I'd be able to know how to live and be in it. So I need post-tragic innocence, right? I need post-tragic innocence, which requires discernment. And in post-tragic innocence, I'm willing to risk, and I have a kind of sufficiently intimate relationship to the field of Eros value that I'm allured to the risks that are mine to take. Something like that.
Yeah,
It's a
thank
lot.
you.
Yeah.
So when we risk, it's, at the level we're speaking about here, it might be a risk that is uniquely mine to take, but its implications and what is being risked is beyond just what can be labeled mine. It's also the case that we can't take anyone else's risk from them. That is theirs to risk. But nevertheless, the risk is one in which we can risk others and the world. And indeed, at the moment, as a civilization and at various levels, we are already involved in risking a lot. As you speak about the death of humanity as well as the death of our humanity, which is a nice distinction.
Mm.
The parts that I struggle with most of all is the suffering and pain and the risk that I'm that I'm opening others to, the danger, or as well, of course, the possibility. But of course, I'm already feel the pull and all the enthusiasm and all of that. So it's, although of course maybe one can be frightened of the good as well, hey, because
Yes.
in a sense, any orientation, any concretion of becoming is in effect as well a negation of other potentialities. It turns out that the unique story was one way and not the other on a particular occasion, and if one isn't sufficiently clarified, as you might say, well, there are parts of you that might want this other thing. Hey, I'm
Good deployment of clarification. Right. Right.
And
Well done.
so, nevertheless,
Yeah.
the risk of others, risk of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps you could speak to that a bit.
Let me say one thing before, which is I've enjoyed talking to you. We're just at we're at the bare beginning of a conversation, but I've enjoyed it, and I just want to thank you for that. Number one, and number two, I want to just honor your dance with language, right? And and clearly you've committed a lot to it, and it's not an easy dance, and it actually, you know, I'm sure opens up space, but also closes other spaces. So I would say that in some sense, if I may, right, we don't have a teacher relationship. We have a kind of new friend relationship through dear Zach. So if I want to compliment you, not from a place which sounds condescending, but from the place of a friend, which is, and perhaps make a kind of diagnostic guess in the best sense of the word, but in a very honoring way, which is that playing with language is part of your unique risk, right? In other words, that's a unique risk, right? It's a very particular one, right? And it has great risk to it, although it's alluring, right? It also can be exhausting, and it also can be obfuscating. And you've made a decision, right, to kind of stand for language in a particular way. And I can feel both, the poetry of it and the goodness of it. And so I want to just bow to that and just honor that, that particular unique risk, which is yours.
For trust.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. And it's just one kind of closing thought. Intimacy, and I've talked to myself and out loud and written a lot about this intimate universe. And of course we're referring not to a human level of intimacy, just like we're not referring to a human level of story, right? In general, my general kind of realization, hard whispered over many years, is that any value or anything, but any value that's disconnected from cosmic magnificence is ultimately pallid. Meaning it's pallid, but also, to translate loosely from Abraham Cook, it doesn't allow the mind ease, right? And I can't actually rest in, right, an intimacy that's dissociated from cosmic intimacy. It's actually non-intimate. It actually can't actually hold me. I won't actually have an experience of being welcome in the universe. So within that context, there's a particular unique risk that I think is all of ours to take, which relates deeply to our conversation, which is it's the risk for wholeness. And if you put a gun to my head, which would be rude, right? But said, okay, and you got, you're kind of channeling Clint Eastwood, and you say, kind of make my day, give me like, okay, just like one clear, unique understanding that emerges from kind of the Solomon wisdom tradition of Kabbalah, I would say that the single most important idea, although no one says it the way I'm about to say it, but it's implicit in not 1,000, tens and tens of thousands of texts, if you read them carefully, is something like there's more God to come. Right? There's more God to come, right? Or there's more wholeness to come, right? Is that the nature of wholeness itself is that it evokes more wholeness, right? So, and I think that's what you meant earlier, right? When you spoke about, tenderly, let's enter into, a particular point of the conversation, although you didn't use these words, but kind of open to what might emerge was kind of the sense of what you were saying, I thought very beautifully, right? What you were really saying is, if I can, what's the more wholeness to come here, right? In other words, and that's the essence of an encounter that's real, of a conversation that's real, that's intimate, where I'm not here to, let me share these 10 ideas that Gafni has, or, you're not here to, let me demonstrate my kind of play in the poetics of language, right? We're actually here to create something new together, right? And new together, that's intimacy, right? In other words, where there's a new wholeness, And the new wholeness means that there's some split off part of me that I need to bring into the conversation. Because intimacy, there's an intimacy equation that we talk about. I won't in this last minute go through all of it, but the first part of the equation, it's an interior science equation, and the first principles and first values book is intimacy equals shared identity in the context of relative otherness. So if I'm split off from a part of myself, then I'm not intimate with my wholeness, right? So my friend Dick Schwartz, who does IFS, internal family systems, is about, okay, how do you make whole that which is split off? And he's obviously coming from, part theory. So, and that a conversation has a degree of intimacy, and this is my last sentence, although it might be ill punctuated. But I want to end with just, if you'll allow me to, a genuine honoring of you and a compliment, which is just in the space of clarifying a number of issues. I went over some new things, and some things I've thought about for many, many years and talked about for many years, but they clarified in a new way. They became more whole in the conversation, which can only be because of the space in between. And so it feels like more whole got created here, right? And let it go into the world, right? And, in whatever channels there's need to be, right? And amen.
All right, Marc, thank you. Yes. A first step in. I appreciate it. A first step in, although I think some currents beamed out to something deeper. So
yes,
not a blind step across the surface, eh?
No, not at all.